Okay, I'm really hoping this is actually live right now. I have my phone here to make sure, but I can't ever be sure it really works. Let's just make sure. Yeah, so the phone doesn't work. That's a shame. Oh, I think it's on. Okay, good. So, hi, I'm Roy. I will be talking to you today about psychological argumentation. I think it's a topic that is sadly not discussed as often in debating and in debating workshops as a whole. I think it probably has to do with the fact that you usually don't have a straight up psychological motion, right? Like it's not like economical motion where you have the word financial in the wording of the motion, and then you can actually know that it's actually in economical motion, right? And it doesn't happen all that often in this kind of debates. However, I would say that in a sense, all debates are in fact about psychology, because in fact, all debates deal with people, right? So in all debates, you make claims about what people want, how people act, how people react to stuff, what do they experience, how they behave accordingly, and stuff like that. So because of all of that, I think it is very important to be able to make a compelling case about what actually it means to be what it actually means to for a person to experience things a certain way, to act a certain way, etc. So I do have a like PowerPoint slideshow for this workshop. I was told that it could be problematic to actually show the workshop in this kind of setting. That is very sad, but we'll try to see if that works, right? A word of warning, a word of caution. This slideshow was like prepared like 4 years ago, so I've updated a bit in some ways, but sadly for the thing that matters most, which is how it looks and how updated the memes in the slideshow is, they are not very updated. Okay, so if you ask yourself, why does the slideshow has memes from like 5 years ago? That's all. Okay, so let's see if that works. So I am going to share my screen, and it would make this weird effect for a second, but now you're supposedly able to see this slideshow itself. Let's just make sure it's indeed what's happening. Just a second. Just a sec. And yes, and suddenly I see nothing on my phone. Let's see what happens if I do hide. Still nothing on my phone. Okay, so at least I can hear myself, even if not see myself. So let's hope the same goes for you too, for you guys as well. Okay, so back to this slide. And again, if you don't see the slide, that is sad, but you could as well be looking at me. I don't think it would make a lot of difference, right? So we're talking about using psychology in when I'm talking about psychological arguments, I am talking about arguments about why people are likely to perceive things a certain way, why they want specific things, why they behave a certain way, or anything like that, right? It's not about whether things are good or bad in and of themselves. It's mostly about how people, act and think about stuff. So, when do we actually use those kinds of argumentation? So the first thing is when we want to analyze what would be the probable action of something, right? So for example, when you have a backlash argument, so-called, where like you say, oh, religious people would see the state as like this imposing entity or something along those lines, this is something that is clearly very much affected by the psychology of those people, right? So say religion people would see the state as an imposing entity, say they would disconnect from the state's institutions. Those are claims about how those people would think and how they would act, right? So this is exactly the kind of things that you want to consider, right? Secondly, I think a place where you would be very much inclined to use this kind of analysis is when talking about happiness, right? So there is this utilitarianistic framework, I would say, in debating that says that we care about people being happy, and this is good in and of itself. So if that's what the things that you want to prove, you want to analyze what makes people happy. So emotion in which this thing could be applicable is emotion like the 8th round of Mexico World, which was this house prefers a world in which all individuals who have achieved a middle-class standard of living choose to pursue the highest level of achievement in their chosen career, rather than a world in which those individuals prioritize a day-to-day enjoyment over work, right? So clearly this is a major shift in the world, and we want to understand in which world people are happier, so you need to analyze happiness. A third place where you could use psychological analysis is if you have a perspective motion. So you obviously want to talk about this specific actor, their motives and intentions, right? So, for example, a motion in which this is likely to be important is a motion like this house as a medical. This house is a medical professional employed by the U.S. military or security services would encourage others to refuse orders to provide medical treatment to individuals undergoing enhanced interrogation techniques. This is from round 9 of Malaysia World, right? So obviously you would want to understand what is the motives of such a person in order to analyze it carefully. And lastly, I would say it's about children. So there are a lot of motion that involve children, and I think that in those kinds of motions, usually people do take the time to explain the specific things that are relevant to children. But again, it's important to know how to do it well, right? So a motion like that could be this house regrets the substitution of digital entertainment like TV, movies, and video games for written materials like novel, Kindles, and comic books in the lives of children. This is from Cambridge IB of 2017. Okay? So those, I think, are all stuff that you probably want to use this kind of analysis that we'll be talking about in this workshop in order to use. And as you can see, this is I think a fairly wide variety of motions, right? That you could use this kind of analysis, which I think just goes to show how prevalent and how useful they are. So let's now talk about specifically what I'm going to discuss in this workshop, okay? Oh, just one more thing I would say, there are also debates about specific mental conditions such as anorexia or depression and other motions around this subject. So I will not be talking about like Freudian psychoanalysis kinds of lines of argumentation in this debate, both because I think they are factually untrue, but B, because they are just not very persuasive, in my opinion. And I'm saying this I'm saying both those things, both as a debater and as a person who is finishing his MA in cognitive science. We would also not be discussing mental conditions. It's just that I just don't have enough time. This is a rather complex subject, and I don't want to make some simplistic statements. And I would say I don't think it applies in that many debates compared with the rest of the stuff that I am going to discuss in this workshop. Okay? So, what we will be talking about in this debate. So one is human behavior. We're going to talk about how people act. Secondly is about happiness, what makes people happy and what not. And lastly, we'll talk about children and how to analyze that group in society. Okay, so let's start. Let's jump right into human behavior. Just before I do that, let's make sure that there aren't some stuff on the chat that I might need to attend to. Anyone has any questions? It does not seem that way. Let me just switch on to my own camera real quick. Yeah, it seems like you can see my workshop. Can you? Let's see if that changes. If I'm moving on to stop sharing the screen. Right, so I see the camera is working again. Yeah, I don't think it actually works to show the screen like I thought it would, which is sad. But no worries, we'll do what we can. Okay, so let's, as I said, move on to human behavior. So here's I want to give you like a basic framework and model to work when you want to talk about human behavior and human action, right? So it's called a folk psychology model, and it's probably not that true in real life and in studies, but I think it's very useful for debate. So here's the model itself. It's about saying that any action is because of that person or group of people holding beliefs and desires. And the idea is that those beliefs and desires are the thing that would determine the action that they would take, right? So let's give an example. When I say, for example, as I've said, that a group is going to backlash, right, against a certain law, right? So what I'm saying is they believe that this law goes against the doctrine of the religion. They desire to maintain the doctrines of the religion, and therefore the action they take is to fight against the law, right? So again, this is the basic point. You have beliefs, you have desires, and by having both of them, you can predict the actions a person would take, okay? Now, I would say, obviously, this assumes that you have focused on the correct group to analyze in the debate. Obviously, you want to, in any debate, both make sure that you focus on the right group and that you analyze them carefully to make sure that the judge goes with you on that. Also, I would say I think a lot of people in the debate focus only on the desire part or only on the beliefs part, and usually they fail to do both. But as I said, I think it is important to do both to make a convincing case in that regard. So let's see how we can make this a bit more fine-tuned, right? So let's say you have the motion, this house would ban advocacy for religious belief in public place. This is from Dutch Open. So they are probably, so usually, again, you would probably want to run some sort of a backlash argument from opposition, and you would probably want to say, as I've said, that this law, they believe that this law goes against the doctrine of the religion, they desire to maintain the doctrines of their religion, and therefore the action they would take is to fight against the law. But see, I can now make it a bit more complicated. So say, okay, if you want to know how they would specifically act, how it is likely that you would fight against this law, so I'd say, look, what they desire is to change the law, right? They believe that the government would succumb to public outcry and political action, and therefore a likely action that they would take is to demonstrate on the street and march on the street, right? So by using, again, more compounded layers of desires and beliefs, you can make a more convincing case for more specific actions if that's what you want in the debate. Okay, so we've done that. Just a second. Still not seeing myself on air. Okay, let's just hope it is actually working. Let me just see. Okay. Right. So as I said, let's move on. In that sense, I think that the benefits of that model is, while obviously it is simplistic, and I'm going to admit that, I think it is very much useful, right? I think it is intuitive to judges and debaters alike. I think it's combines our ideas of, like, how we are comprised of logic and emotion. So like the desires are like the emotions we have, and the beliefs are like the more logical parts of us. Again, I don't buy this whole dichotomy to begin with, but I think it fits into that rather nicely. I think it's fairly easy to use. I think that in almost any action, it's very easy to identify at least several desires and several beliefs that stand behind it. And I would say, I think it's useful also because the array of desires and beliefs stays constant, right? So usually when we are analyzing a group in a debate, we assume that this debate doesn't like change their entire belief system, change everything that they desire. No, right? We usually just assume that this kind of array of beliefs and desires stays constant, and therefore we could use it to analyze stuff in the debate. Okay, so this so far has been fairly simple because it only talked about how to analyze your own argument in a debate. But obviously, debate is never about just doing your own thing. It's about weighing against other people and what they're doing, right? So this obviously makes matters more complicated, right? Because when other debaters claim there would be different actions, and now you need to start weighing against it. So let's talk about those complications. And the idea is very simple. Okay. If I am claiming that a certain action will take place, that is based on the beliefs and desires I think that party holds. And you claim that a different action is going to take place. You claim, for example, that the people that we've talked about before, the religious people, are in fact not going to march in the streets. They are just going to keep quiet and play along, right? Okay, so you say they'll keep quiet and play along. I say they would be demonstrating and marching in the streets. Who is right? So in order to determine that, again, I would need to ask myself, what are the beliefs and desires that that are in the root of the actions you describe? What are the beliefs and desires that are in the root of your claim that those people would keep quiet and play along? So perhaps, while my belief is that they think this law goes against the doctrine of their religions, you would say that they would also believe that the government could escalate with further limitations and restrictions on the religion if they start marching on streets, right? And when it comes to desires, again, I'm saying that they want to maintain the doctrines of the religion, but you're saying that they want to avoid sanctions proposed by OG's model in some way, right? Like, I don't know, maybe there is a very heavy fine or something like that for advocacy now. So now we need to weigh which is more likely, right? I'm saying the most likely thing is they would march on the streets. You're saying they would keep quiet. We have identified the beliefs in the roots of both. We have identified the desires at the roots of both. We understood that we are clashing, not about the actions, but about the beliefs and desires that are in the root of those actions. And now we need to start weighing the beliefs and start weighing the desires. How can we do that? So let's start with weighing the beliefs. Just a second. Let's see if it's getting better in any way. Current no. I'm just like texting people, making sure it's okay, because I can't know, sadly, for myself. But fine. Okay. At least like I know that the sound is alright. So if push comes to shove, you can just listen to me for a bit of time. Okay, so we want to, as I've said, weigh the beliefs people have, right? So if I want to make a claim that my belief is more likely than the belief you are saying, I need obviously to focus about this specific person in mind. And I want to focus, I think, on two things. One would be the real world knowledge that that person holds. And secondly is about the interpretation, is how does that person interprets the real world knowledge that I've mentioned, okay? So let's talk first of all about real world knowledge in and of itself, right? I think that if you want to ask yourself what do people know and what do people believe, you need to ask yourself, what are the mediums through which that person gets their information, right? Because, for example, on the mainstream media, you can get very different information than what you're getting on InfoWars, right? So that will affect what is the real world knowledge that you have. Secondly, I think it's about the frequency, right? Just one more thing. When I said about the medium, it's not just that they have different info in the mainstream media and InfoWars, it's also about the credibility you lend to it, right? So I, for example, find whatever I find on mainstream media to be more credible than whatever is on InfoWars, although I'm sure there are a bunch of people who think that InfoWars are in fact a lot more credible than the mainstream media. Okay, so those are also differences in how you address the medium. A second thing that would determine this clash of belief is about the frequency, right? So I think that while people don't believe anything that you tell them once, I think that if they hear something enough times from enough different sources, they are more likely, sadly, to believe it over time. So if there is a message or idea or something that's just talked about a lot, it's much more likely that this would be part of the real world knowledge that that person has. And lastly, I think it's about the quality, right? So I think about the difference of when you see a video of something compared when you just hear someone saying something. I think that when you have this video in mind, we all lend more credibility and more impact to that video, even if we shouldn't, okay? So those three, all of those three, what is the medium? What is the frequency that you hear something? And what is the quality of how it gets to you? both all of those would affect what kind of real world knowledge that you have. And obviously, please note, this could also be true for like absolutely false ideas, right? Like it's very likely that people would believe false ideas, but again, given those tools, you could argue that in fact those false ideas are still likely to be held by those people or not, right? It's about analysis. So how can I use what I've just said in a debate? Let's say we have the debate, this house would ban, this house believes that the US should ban extremist groups such as the neo-Nazis or the KKK. From opposition, it's very likely to make the case that, in fact, more people would join the neo-Nazis and the KKK if you would ban them as a state. Now, let's do it our way, right? So the desire that lies here is that many people might have the same goals as those groups, right? They feel like superior, they want to like regain control of their own country to make their voices heard, whatever, right? Now, before the motion, they may have believed that those groups are using, measures that are like way too extreme and violent. And now, after the motion, they think that those measures are reasonable because the government is trying to ban them. Okay, so this is like viewed as a defense. Now, so far, this is just like the basic argument we want to make about how many people would join those extremist groups. However, how can I make this claim even stronger? So I think a likely rebuttal that you could get is that, in fact, no one is going to see it that way because everyone knows that the neo-Nazis and the KKK are like a violent group, and there was the event in Charlottesville in which a peaceful protester has been killed, and therefore it won't seem like unreasonable. It won't seem unreasonable. It would actually seem very reasonable given those kind of recent events. So how can I protect my argument against this analysis? I could say, well, look, let's talk about what is the real world knowledge of those potential KKK recruits, right? And I would say those people, in fact, don't think that the events in Charlottesville happened, right? They, or at least it didn't happen that way. They think it was two-sided, or like they think that the KKK members there were attacked or whatever, stuff like that, right? So now I would start channels. I would say, let's talk about the medium. They are probably hearing about the events of Charlottesville in their own forums or social media, like from people that they know and they trust. So they lend a lot more credibility to those kinds of reports, even if they are false. When it comes to frequency, I would say, look, they spend time in those forums and social media every day, and like they almost never listen to mainstream media. So it's very likely that this is like the frequent message that they hear all the time. And therefore, it's very likely that this is what they're going to believe. When it comes to quality, I would say, look, probably in those forums, they talk about it vividly. They probably have like, you know, images or even videos from that demonstration. They would have strong and uncensored language or personal stories, and like they would actively engage with your question. So again, when it comes to the quality, you will get a much more specific quality of much larger quality of real world knowledge, and therefore would believe it. So I think this shows you how you could use your analysis to make it more likely that your case is true. But as I've said, it's not only about the real world knowledge. Let's move on to interpretation, because even if we all have the same real world knowledge, we could all interpret it in a very different fashion, right? If I see the police arresting a KKK member, right? We can all agree that the police have arrested him, but we could have very different interpretation of that scenario, right? I would say it's a good act in which the police protected society from a dangerous individual. Another person who is a KKK associate might say, oh, this is actually the police taking a peaceful person who has done nothing wrong to jail over his beliefs, right? So again, it's a lot about what you interpret a thing to be. So how can we weigh interpretations when it comes to belief? So one, I think, is about the existing worldview. So I think most of us, when anything happens to us, we try to make it fit with our existing worldview, right? So if you're a black person and you see the police arresting black people more often than not, you're saying, oh, this is a proof that the police is in fact racist. But if you're a KKK member, oh, you're saying, oh, this is a proof that black people are more dangerous than white people, right? So it's about the previous existing worldview that you have, that through it you interpret whatever is going on in the world. The second thing is about common schemas, I would say. It's the Hebrew pronunciation, I'm not sure how to say it in English. And common schemas is basically about certain ideas that, like, you know, are out there and are fairly easy for people to grasp. So a good example is probably stereotypes, like, you know, how girls are not good in math, right? So regardless of whether that's true or not, this is a common idea in society, and therefore it's very likely for people to take evidence and see things through that lens if that happens. So it could be stereotypes, it also could be ideas, right? Like the idea that something is politically motivated is a very common schema in certain countries when someone is accused of corruption, right? So any accusation of corruption is actually seen as actually being political persecution. So again, it's about whatever common schema is likely for, again, I remind you, for the specific person we're talking about in this debate, right? The third is about the relation to the medium, which is something that, as I've said before, even if you think that that medium is showing you the truth, the relation to the medium is going to determine how you're going to interpret it, right? So if it could be only about whether I believe him or not believe him, but for example, if I hear about a law from a religious leader I trust a lot, it's a lot more likely I'm going to interpret it as a dangerous law, even if it is just stating the facts of what the law is, right? Because it's about, you know, his demeanor and whatever else he's saying about that law that isn't about the facts, that is going to have a large impact on me. And maybe that would even be a call to action. Well, if I would just read about it on the news, I would say, yeah, that's a law. I'm not sure like how good or bad is it. I am obviously not going to do something about it myself, right? So the medium, whether it's a person you trust or a person you distrust or a authority figures or a role model or whatever is the medium that you hear about, that you hear things about from, this is going to be incredibly important to the question of of how you interpret the data you get from there. And lastly, I think it's about complex belief systems. So there are certain complex belief systems that we hold. I think the best example is religion. So religion is a very complex belief system that encompasses both morality and metaphysical ideas, etc. And whatever is you're going to learn about the world, it's very likely as a religious person, you would interpret it through this religion lens in that sense, okay? So it's a bit like an existing worldview, but the point is that it could be a lot more complex than any other worldview that a person has, okay? So let's again give an example of how I'm going to use that kind of analysis, right? So back to our example with KKK. Now, government have said that the action seems reasonable given the recent events with the KKK. So let's say I agree with them about what happened in Charlottesville, right? Like I agree, like a peaceful protester has been attacked and stuff like that. I could still not agree on the interpretation of that real world knowledge, right? Like I could still say this still isn't like a reasonable reaction to whatever happened in Charlottesville, right? Why is that likely that this would be seen that way? Let's analyze the interpretation that a prospective KKK member might give here. So he might say, you know what, the government is controlled by leftists, and this is therefore a form of political persecution and not just reasonable action, right? This is something that would fit in the worldview and the common schemas that person holds. Maybe he would say, you know what, freedom of speech is holy. Why do you stop upholding it when it comes to the KKK? Why don't you do it for the Black Lives Matter movement when they are being violent? And of course, it doesn't matter if they are not, right? It's just about the interpretation of the act of being politically motivated and harming sacred values like freedom of speech. It would be about their relation to the media, right? So they're very likely to hear about this ban from, you know, their own forum, from their own social circle, where they would get it with like the most extremist interpretations and criticism that they could get, right? So they're very likely to see it, as I've said, as persecution and as an unreasonable government reaction. And lastly, it's about the complex belief system, right? So I would say, if you're part of the KKK, you probably believe that the state is just a means to an end, which is like, you know, white tyranny or whatever. And therefore, like, if it's not fulfilling the right agenda, it should be dismissed. It should not be granted any sort of value, etc. Right? So, and therefore, obviously, any action they do is unreasonable in that regard. So, as I've said, this is the way you could probably interpret the same thing that you could agree with opposition with government are happening in this. The same thing that you could agree with government that those prospective KKK members believe, and still just using the interpretation of those real world knowledge, you could still win this clash of beliefs. Now, everything I've just done is obviously super long, right? There is absolutely no reason why you should spend that much time on just like one argument, right? I'm just like trying to show you different ways you could approach the same argument to make it more believable. I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and then we're going to continue with clashes of desires, okay? Okay. I want to check if there's more likely when if there's like a you know, a picture that way. Like I'm unsure about that. I think every time like I move on to the slide, like it stops showing the picture, which is relatively sad, I would say. No, I'm unsure how to do that. Okay, that is sad. Okay. Okay. I don't know what's happening. Okay. Moving on, as I said, to clashes of desires, right? So, again, obviously, we want to talk about who is this person that we're talking about, right? What we believe their desires would be, right? Let's talk about how we can do that. So, when we're talking about what a person desire, I think we need to distinguish between two ways of understanding it. One is about what that person needs in a more of like objective sense. The other is what that person wants in a more of a subjective sense. And I think it's about how you view people, right? If you think that people, you like assume some kind of rationality, then you would say, you know what, we just need to talk about what a person needs, and that person is very likely to want the things that he needs, right? However, if you think that it's about what a person wants, and you have like this assumption of emotion-driven behavior, then what that person needs is, doesn't necessarily mean something about what a person wants, and you want to talk about what a person wants regardless of their needs. Okay. Just a second. I need to plug my computer. Oh, okay. Okay, right. So, okay. Let's see if it's something I'm doing here that might do the trick. Just a second. Nope, that seems to work. Nope, don't know what's going on with the image here. It all seems to be working. Okay, so moving on. So as I said, it's about how you view desires. I'm saying whatever is the view of desires that you have. I'm just going to say, like, stick to one. Okay, don't go too far. I think it would just make it more confusing. So let's again give an example here. So on the motion, this house will pay all elected politicians the median wage in their country. This is from the first round from Vienna EUDC 2015. So opposition would probably say something along the lines of, you would drive away talented people from being politicians because they want a comfortable lifestyle, and government might say, you know what, no, that people would still come. They don't care about the lifestyle. They want like power and fame and ideology and other stuff that you get from being other stuff that you get from being a politician. So this is obviously a clash of desires, right? One team says it's about a comfortable lifestyle, and the other team says it's about power, fame, ideology, and stuff like that. So how do we weigh between those clashes? So one way to do so would be to, as I said, talk about the needs and wants, right? So from opposition, it would say, you know what, we think people are, somewhat rational. They understand that politics is hard and stressful, and you can't afford to also worry about making rent or like healthcare or your children's education when you're on median wage, right? Like, this is not something that you do. You understand that, and therefore you would just not go into politics. From the government, I would not talk that much about some kind of like assumption of rationality. I would just say, look, those people are motivated by their ideology. They have a burning desire to impact society and change things. Those are just not people who wanted a comfortable lifestyle, right? Those, if they wanted a comfortable lifestyle, they would, I don't know, like go to be managers in some kind of business section and not be and not actually be and not be politicians. Okay, so this was like very basic kind of weighing. Let's make it a bit more interesting. So I'm going to give you, I think, 3 ways to weigh between different desires when you want to talk about when you want to talk about weighing between them. So one is the idea of hierarchy, right? It's a very simple idea. It says you probably cannot get one desire without achieving another. So in this debate, from opposition, says, look, if you want like power and fame and like embracing your ideology as a politician, you can only do it if you focus all your time on that kind of politician. If you spend your time on, how can I make ends meet, How can I care about my children's education? How can I care about my wife being sick because she doesn't have good enough treatment and stuff like that? If that's the case, very, very unlikely that you would actually get the power and fame and ideology that you actually want. So a comfortable lifestyle is in fact a stepping stone to achieve all the other stuff that you want as a politician. And because of that, it is very unlikely that you would choose to become a politician in that sense. A second way to weigh is about having unique desires. So what is the idea here? It's the idea that an action could fulfill many desires, but we need to compare it with other actions that you could take, right? So if, for example, I want an intellectual challenge, I could go to a debating competition and I could go to a chess competition. However, if for example, I also want to meet a lot of friendly people, I could therefore achieve both in a debating competition, but you couldn't achieve that in chess competitions because everyone knows that people who play chess are assholes, right? So this is about having your unique needs met in one way and not in another. So using it in that debate, from government, I would say, look, a comfortable lifestyle is something that you would still get under, you would probably still get under while being a politician, because it's just about what you're getting used to over time. However, ideology is like always, this like unachieved goal that is always there, and the only way to do it is if you're in politics, and therefore, like politics, being in politics answers this unique desire of ideology, and therefore therefore it's a lot more likely, and as I said, a desire that is less likely to be met. Therefore, it's more likely that you would choose to be in politics because of that. The third thing is about a compromise, right? So again, the idea is saying, well, since you can have it all, you need to ask yourself which action is more likely to get you to more of your desires, right? So again, on opposition, I would say, look, if you're outside of the political system, you could achieve, you are getting this comfortable lifestyle, and you get this somewhat reduced ability to have your fame and ideology to be achieved, because you could be rich and donate to politicians or influence them or something like that, right? However, I would say, when you're being a politician, it is like a very detrimental harm to your lifestyle, and you know what, you're probably not even getting that much power and fame and ideology, because you're just one of many politicians, right? So again, I think it seems close to the second one of having a unique need, but the difference is that when it comes to compromise, you're treating all your needs as equal in a sense, and just asking where can you achieve more of them by which action. When it's about a unique desire, you're saying, since that desire is unique and you could only achieve it in one way, while other desires you could achieve using the alternatives. Okay, so this is the difference there. Lastly, we want to talk about higher level desires, because the thing is that humans are complicated, and the fact that they desire one thing on one level does not mean that they do not desire another thing on another level. So a good example in this debate would be something along the lines that says, from government, they would say people are in politics as a column, right? This is like the way they realize their core values. Why is that important? Because that means that those people see this uncomfortable lifestyle actually as a cross to bear that makes their efforts more meaningful. So while on the basic level, they might desire a comfortable lifestyle, I would say on a higher level, actually, they don't want a comfortable lifestyle. They want a lifestyle that is hard, because that makes their efforts more meaningful in their lives, right? So once you start incorporating those kinds of like higher level desires, this actually lets you weigh between different desires in that sense, and actually, like, play around with the levels of the hierarchy that I gave you before. So I think this is a good way to weigh between desires. Moving on now, so we've talked about weighing beliefs, we talked about weighing desires. Let's make it now actually even more complicated. Because so far we had this model that says you had beliefs, you had desires, and frankly, those things, just are in fact all you need to know. Okay, if you know a person's beliefs, you know the desires, just you know what is going to happen next in terms of their actions. But actually, you don't, because, and this is where it gets complicated. People are not this kind of machines that you could just predict their actions. One reason is because people have biases. Biases basically means that even if you know what are the beliefs and the desires of that person, he might not act based on those as you'd expect because he's biased in some way. So I think bias analysis is not something that is fairly common in a debate. I would still say probably most people could improve on. Why is that true? So I would say two reasons. I think is that most people, sadly, never bother to explain their bias, right? It's just like saying there's a bias. And saying there's a bias does not actually mean that it's there or that it's very much powerful. Now, I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily confront you on that. They wouldn't tell you, oh no, you're actually are lying to me and this bias doesn't exist. But they could play it down, okay? So you want to explain. So how do you explain a bias? You usually talk about, again, how it makes people feel, or you want to say how it makes them feel good about themselves or feel good about the future, or how it's less mentally taxing to use this kind of shortcuts that the biases let you, right? And you want to also provide a lot of examples, obviously, to make it interesting and to clarify your point, right? So let's say I want to explain optimism bias. I would say, look, people have had, it's fun for people to think about good events, right? When you think about something that's good happens, you smile. Since it's fun to talk about the fun events, and it's not fun to think about bad outcomes, people are more likely to focus on good outcomes rather than bad, and this is the optimism bias. And a good example for that is how sports fans always think this is the year that their team wins the championship, right? And like they never win, and every year they think, oh no, but this year it's going to happen. Why? Because they want to believe that happens. They have a lot of fun thinking about the possible outcome in which their team wins, right? So this is how you both explain a bias and give an example to it. Now, let's talk about what happens when you have okay, so this is an example. Let's talk about some common bias in debate. So one is optimism bias. So for example, in a debate like this house supports the death penalty, you could run the line that, you know what, this is not likely to deter criminals because they are optimists. They do not think that they would get caught, and if they don't think they would get caught, the size of the punishment, frankly, isn't that intimidating, right? It's just about your chances of getting caught, right? So this is, I think, a small example of how you can use optimism bias. Also, I would say specifically for optimism bias, it's probably used too much. In fact, like, as far as we know, people aren't like always optimistic, have always optimistic biases about everything, right? I think we all know people who worry a lot and they don't think good things would happen to them. Also, I think most people, for example, and this is backed by research, wouldn't take a bet about if I'm like going to flip a coin and 50% chance means it comes out heads, 50% chance it comes out tails. If it heads, you win $120. if it tails, you lose 100, right? So although it is a good bet to take on rational mathematical reasoning, most people wouldn't do it, right? Why? Because people are, as we know, are risk averse, right? They actually are afraid of losses, and therefore they do not want it. And if people indeed had this optimism bias, they would just say, "Oh no, but I'm going to win. I'm going to take the $120, right? So obviously that's what I should do." But frankly, people don't. So the point is, when someone just says optimism bias, don't just buy into it, right? Don't let them to get away with it. So the second bias is short-term bias, right? Or it's known as temporal discounting. It basically means that you care less about what happens in the future. And again, it's because things that are happening right now are a lot more vivid when you think about them, and therefore they are a lot more tempting or a lot more scary or a lot more important, whatever you want to call it, right? So how do we use a short-term bias in debate? So for example, in a motion like this house would limit time in office for head of state to 2 terms, you could say that, contrary to what opposition might tell you, it's very unlikely that a head of state is going to use the fact that he has many terms to promote this kind of like long-term policies, because you know what, people actually think and vote based on the short term and not on the long term, and sadly that means that they don't care all that much about what that person is going to do in the long term, right? So he has no political incentive to pursue that kind of goal, right? This is just an example. In order to make it a bit more speedier, I'm going to talk about the 3 next biases, all in the context of the same debate, right? So you could see how this can be used, I think, in a more nuanced way, which would be more helpful. So so the debate is this media should show the full horrors of war. So if one of you remember, like, the classic Shen Wu meme there. So one could say another bias that is very powerful is the drop at the ocean. Basically, it means that people, since they have a lot of problem comparing things, out there in the air, they are usually opting for relative comparisons, right? So, for example, if I told you that you could save $10 by going to the store across the street and buy a toaster for $10 instead of $20, many people would probably say, "Oh, sure, I would do that." Right? I would go that I don't know 30 feet in order to make sure that I get a better toaster with $10 less. However, if you were to buy a car and you were to be offered to go to a shop across the street and get $10 less for the car, which costs like, I don't know, $50,000, most people would say, "No, absolutely not," right? I would not use like $10. I won't do it just for $10, right? But it's still $10 for walking down the street, right? The main question is, how do those $10 compare relative to the entire price? Is it $10 out of 20 or $10 out of 50,000, right? So this is obviously so this is how people think, and this is a bias that is very important, right? So for example, in a motion like this house believes that the media should show the full horrors of war, I would come from a position and say, you know what, when you are faced with such, like, bombarded with such terrible horrors, like, all the time, any action seems like, futile and meaningless, because this is like entirely horrible, and my actions couldn't possibly change all that, right? So, and therefore it's very likely that people would actually give up and would not want to help, or would not want to do anything for the suffering people in those wars, right? So this is obviously a bad thing. So this is how you could use that bias. Another bias is about sunk cost. So sunk cost means that usually people consider money that they've spent before not as being lost, which it technically is, but as being used in a certain way, and that affects how they view what they should do right now. So Assume, for example, I've got a ticket to a very expensive hotel, like plane ride in a hotel somewhere, and I've spent that money, and now it's 10 in the morning, and I wonder, should I go out on that trip or not? And you know what? I just don't want, right? Like, I'm incredibly sick. I know that this trip is just going to make me more miserable. And you know what? Most people are going to take the trip. Why? Because you say, oh, I've already paid about it. But please notice, it doesn't matter if you already paid. The main question is, like, that money is lost. It's gone. The main question is, will going on the trip make you happier or not? And still people would say, no, but I've spent the money on it, I would go, right? Like, the idea is, if I don't go, those are like 25,000, those are like $2,500 or whatever down the drain. But if I am going, this is like spending that money, and it's not lost, right? This is how people think. And again, this is a fairly common bias for anyone who studies cognitive science. And again, how I would use that in a debate. So again, I would say, in the motion about the media showing the full horrors of war, I would say, from a position, look, when you see how horrible that war is, you actually commit even more resources to it in order to not feel all the destruction there was for nothing. And obviously, that just makes it more likely that there will be more destruction and more horrors because of that. But you don't want, like, this cost to be sunk. You don't want it to be lost completely. The last thing is about confirmation bias. It's about how we all want to believe things based on what we already believe, because we want to feel good about ourselves, like we're smart, and therefore we want to find evidence to confirm our worldview and how smart we are, right? And again, I would say, in this context of the media and war, I would say, look, the fact that this is horrible things are going on in war are actually serving both sides, right? Both people who are for the war, this confirms their idea of how terrible this war is. People who people who are against the war, it confirms their idea of how terrible this war is and how it should be stopped. People who are for the war, it just proves how you need to clean this up by committing more resources and ending the conflict, right? So no matter on which side you are, it's just going to confirm what you believe. And then I could say, well, you know what? If both sides just are going to believe whatever they believe right now, but even stronger, then that means it just creates a more divided society that is probably not in a condition to handle a war going on right now, right? So I think you could also see how everything I'm just saying is just connecting back to what we've already said, right? So optimism bias is about your desire to be happy. Confirmation bias is about your having an existing worldview and confirming it. This is all, I think, ties back better. The last thing I want to talk about when talking about oh, and obviously I would say this is obviously a non-exhaustive list of biases. Please do look up more. It's also fairly interesting, I believe, but I think you should probably read about it more. So the last thing I want to talk about is about analyzing behavior without beliefs and desires. And I'm going to do it not because I think it is impossible to explain what I'm going to explain right now without using beliefs and desires. It's just saying that in that case, it's probably a better idea not to do that. I think the added analysis of the beliefs and desires is not going to be very important. So, talking about behavior without beliefs and desires, the idea is that most of our behavior is in fact not really this methodical, right? It's not about you believe something and you want something and then you say, aha, so if I want that and I believe that, then I'm going to do what fits there. But there are a lot of things that we do regardless. So one example that I think is very important is habits, right? I think that people don't like changing their habits, right? They don't want like more choices. They want to minimize the amount of effort that they have to dedicate to making choices, and therefore they want to default. And this is why we all develop habits, right? And this is why we also stick to them. And it's very likely to analyze what your behavior is going to take through the habits that you actually have. So an example to it would be this house would provide welfare in the form of basic goods and services instead of cash payments, right? So government might say this would make sure that the poor use them in a smart way when they're under welfare. But there could be this question of, wait, but would that continue after they stop being in welfare, when they start making their own money? And it would be a good idea on government side to say, well, you know what, yes, it would actually continue because you develop this habit that you got when you were poor and on welfare, but you just maintain those habits even when it turns to cash, right? Now, obviously, habits can change, right? It's not like they couldn't. But I would say if you want to argue that habits will change, you probably want to argue how there is an awareness to the process, right? How people understand that they have this habit that they need to change, how they have a good reason to change their habits in this situation, and you probably want to say what, like, kind of like breaks the loop, right? Because we all like get up in the morning and do the things that we're used to, and if you want to say that we would stop doing it, something has to break the loop in that sense. It could be like something meaningful in your life, like getting fired, but I think also like changing what kind of grocery store you're going to is very likely to change the things you buy, because you are not used to going to the same aisles and pick up the same things, but now you have to look for them, and therefore it changes. It's more likely that you would notice other products and stuff like that. Right? So again, this is probably how you would analyze a change in habits. So that was about habits. A second way, I think, that you're likely to analyze behavior without beliefs and desires is about societal or peer pressure, right? And again, I think this is a fairly powerful tool, peer pressure, if you want to analyze it. The most obvious example, I think it's fairly known, is Ashe's experiment. So they put you in a room with a bunch of other participants, and they have like those lines on the walls, and you need to say whether you think you need to say which line is longer than which one. And what they do is they make sure the other participants are all lying and saying, you know what, this is actually a lot longer than this, which is I think it's fairly it's not. And then the participant also says, yes, you know what, it was longer just because everyone else said it, right? And the reason we all adhere to peer pressure that much is because we're just not that true that we are wrong and we're right and everyone else is wrong, but also it's just because I think we're social creatures, right? We care a lot about how we look, and we will, and thirdly, I would say we say, you know what, if I am right here, then I would be harmed by my peers. They might judge me or something like that. But if I am wrong, then you know what? It's not really like my responsibility. Right? Like everyone here was wrong. So it lets you like shift responsibility to other people. So how I would use that in a debate? I would say in a debate like this house would allow soldiers to opt out of the military missions on the basis of conscience. Opposition might say, oh, you know what, soldiers would do it all the time, the units would be wrecked, like no mission would ever be accomplished. You could say, well, you know what, there is a lot of peer pressure to join in and be part of the team, right? It's very unlikely that you would do it all the time. You would probably do it on very rare occasions when it's like, this specific mission like really goes against the fundamental core of your moral beliefs, and that is the more likely situation. And if you want to analyze a bit more thoroughly about peer pressure, you probably want to establish who is the important group of influence on that specific actor. It could be family, it could be friends, co-workers, units in the army, whatever. Also, it's important to know that it's fairly easy to break peer pressure. So you usually need a very small group of dissenters, maybe even just one person to dissent from the groups for others to join. This is again, I think it's a useful point of analysis. Okay, so the third way to analyze behavior, not without talking about beliefs and desires, is talking about role models. So again, I think most of us see this role model, and we think that they are smart or cool or pretty or whatever. And then, we want to either, just be like them specifically, or you want to feel close to that role model, or you just think, it's just like, this is the way you become smart or cool or pretty. You just do what they do, right? So, and again, I don't think that people think what I just said, but I think this is like the reason that role models are very effective in changing what we do. So how I would use that in a motion like, this house believes that the creation of feminist icons and their cult of personalities are good for the feminist movement. It's from government, you could say, what, this makes like, Taylor Swift tend to adopt and support feminist ideas because they want to be like Taylor Swift. And please notice, from opposition, I would make the opposite kind. I would say, what, people who don't like Taylor Swift look at sensible feminist ideas that she puts out there and actually think this like ridiculous provocation by a wannabe musical type, right? So please notice, it means that role models could be both positive and negative. You could say, this is someone I don't want to be like for some reason, right? And I think there's an interesting question of like what it means to be like your role model. Like, what are the important metrics in being like your role model? Because I think that obviously, if you think that Taylor Swift is a very, very good singer, you might want to sing like Taylor Swift. But I think many young girls will say, I also want to dress like Taylor Swift, right? And when it comes to feminist ideas, it's very unlikely are they also going to care about feminist ideas put out by Taylor Swift? Because obviously at some point it becomes ridiculous, right? Like, I want to believe that if accidentally Taylor Swift would cut off her finger, not all their fans would say, oh man, like, cutting off your fingers, what a cool thing to do, I want to be like Taylor Swift, right? So I think there is a question of like, what is the metric that makes you like your role model? Lastly, I would say about this topic is authority figures. So again, I think authority is something that is incredibly powerful and changes to a large extent how we act. And I think that happens because we are very prone to authority on several levels. The most obvious example is again Milgram's experiment, the one where you took participants and you tricked them into believing that they need to electrocute another participant, and what the experiment shows is you just like meet someone who looks like an authority figure, like like someone in a doctor's lab coat, and he says you must continue with this study, and people just they continue, right? Like they don't say, oh no, I how dare you say that, like who even are you, how dare you tell me to do such terrible things. You just continue on electrocuting people to a point where they think it is potentially fatal electrocution, right? And the reason is not that all people are like horrible people, but just authority is sadly an incredibly powerful thing in our society. This is both of evolutionary basis, where it's probably would be a good idea to listen to your authority figure in like the groups of hunter-gatherers, whatever, as people. But also I think about education, right? Like from the moment you can talk, you are ordered to listen. You're always told that you should listen to your parents and to your teachers and to your boss, etc. I think also it's about the fact that it makes you shift responsibility, right? So you're saying it's not mine. It's not, again, if I'm wrong here, it's not on me, it's on the authority figure. You might also believe that the authority figure literally knows better than you because they're an expert or something. And you could also fear the punishment from the authority figure, right? So there are very good reasons why authority is such a powerful tool in our society. So again, how I would use that in debate. So in a motion like, this house believes that leaders of minority religion groups should strongly encourage their congregations to refrain from public displays of their faith, like going around with a yarmulke or with prayer beads if you're Muslim and stuff like that. So opposition might say, you know what, the congregation would turn to extremist views and not adhere to that congregation leader. And I would say from government, no, you know what, they actually would listen, because the congregation leader is an incredible, powerful authority figure, and they do not accept the authority of any extremist leader that they've never heard about. And therefore, again, it's very likely that that will be the determining cause in their actions. Now, obviously, there could be multiple authorities, right? Like I have friends and educators and leaders and stuff like that. And you need to probably identify which is the most powerful authority for that specific party. Also, dissent could be a powerful tool against authority figures as well, although it probably has to do with the question of what happens to that dissenter after they dissent from the authority figure, right? Like if he's severely punished by the authority figure, then it might do the opposite effect. Okay, so far we have talked about behavior, right? We have, I think, successfully shown, hopefully, successfully shown that if you want to analyze how people would behave, you want to focus about their desires and their beliefs. You want to weigh the desires that you claim against you want to weigh the actions that you claim are going to happen against the actions the other side is going to claim, the other side claims is going to happen. And you want to weigh those by breaking it down into the beliefs and desires and weigh them off individually. Or you could go through the lines of explaining the biases or things that would affect your behavior without going into that analysis, using what we told you, which was habits, role models, peer pressure, and authority. Okay, that was about behavior. Let's talk now about happiness. And so far, by the way, was also the longer part of the talk. It's going to be faster now. So let's talk about happiness. And I think happiness is incredible. Knowing how to analyze happiness in the debate is incredibly important for three reasons. One is because it's an impact in most debate. Again, like under this utilitarian framework, we want people to be happy. Therefore, it's an impact if you show that one side makes the other makes people happy, or harms them, or on the other side, etc. A second reason you want to analyze happiness is because it's a way to analyze desires, right? So people want to be happy as a whole. If you could analyze happiness in a good way, it would be a way to analyze why people would act in that way, right? Because why they would act that way, because it makes them happy. Let's explain why that makes them happy. And the third reason, and this is probably the most important reason in my mind to talk about happiness, is I think there are a lot of those more complicated debates, like debates that are more like sci-fi or more about philosophy, that really question like the basic core of what happiness is. And I think that while those debates aren't that often, I think they are a lot more often in out-rounds or in late stages of bigger tournaments. And I think it's also one of those runs that it really either makes or breaks, right? Like you either swoop over the debate, or you lose in a very frustrating way. So it's important to know how to do those specific rounds. So let's talk about happiness. I'm going to talk about three ways to analyze happiness. The first is about elements of happiness. The second is about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the third one is just about getting what you want. So let's move on. The first one, as we said, is about elements of happiness, and the idea behind elements of happiness is just you know what makes people happy? Just like a bunch of stuff, right? It's being healthy, it's having high social status, it's having meaningful relationships, it's having money, it's having kids, it's having religion, it's having hobbies, just many stuff that makes people happy. And those are unconnected, and you could want more of those or less of others, and you could want more some and you could want some more than the other. Right? Like this is like, I think, a fairly basic notion of happiness. I think it's also mostly undisputed. Like very few people would argue that being healthy is important to being happy, or that having high social status is important. Obviously, people might have more issue with like kids or religion or money, right? But I think overall it's fairly undisputed in most debates. The question is obviously, okay, so I have this long list of stuff that makes you happy. What do you now do with it in a debate? And obviously what you want is to weigh between them, right? You want to, again, focus on the individual and explain why to that individual one element is more important in their happiness than other, right? So one way to do it is just like, just like playing the numbers game, saying like, on one side you get both health and social status and meaningful relationships and money. On one side you only get money, right? So just playing the numbers game. A second one I would say is, again, talking about this sort of Pareto element, right? Like you could achieve one using others in a sense, or like you could at least achieve one without harming others, right? So you say, you know what, if you have like a high social status, that means it's easier to get a relationship because people are attracted to people with higher social status. That's having a meaningful relationship is usually a stepping stone to having kids, right? So it's very likely that social status is at least more important than just having meaningful relationships, because you could get both social status and a meaningful relationship if you go there. The third is about like diminishing marginal utility. So the idea is like if you have a lot of money, then probably getting money won't be important in making you happy. If you are incredibly healthy, then being a bit more healthy is not going to be incredibly important. And so it's it's about what you lack and not what you already have. And the fourth one is just breaking down the pros and cons. Right? Like, we talk about children and say yes, children are a blessing, but there are also like a lot of responsibilities and worries. And religion, it could be very demanding, and all those kinds of things that makes it that you just have those cons that other elements of happiness do not have. A quick word on how one could use that in a debate. So in a debate like this house would require individuals to give all their wealth beyond $5 million to charity. Opposition might say, you know what, now those people just stop working, and that would be a huge terrible thing to happen to our economy. From government, you could say, well, you know what, think about it for a second. Those people who earn beyond $5 million, they probably have enough money at this point, so they're probably not working just for the money. They're probably working for the social status of like being with the manager, or it's the relationships with people that they have at work that makes them happy, or because it's just something they like to do as like more of a hobby kind of thing, and therefore it's very likely that they would continue working. And as you notice, I just like showed you that as an analysis of a likely action. But as I've said, this is a good application of the idea of like those elements of happiness or happiness in general. The next way to think about happiness is what's known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the idea here is that actually, you know what, it's not just like those disconnected elements of happiness. Some elements of happiness are contingent on other elements of happiness, and therefore that makes them more or less important, right? So the steps that he claims are you first of all have your physical needs, right? Like food, water, not being cold and stuff like that. If you fulfill those needs, you have security needs, which is having shelter, having steady supply of food, basically maintaining those physical needs, but now for the foreseeable future. If you have that, now you can take care of your social needs, right? The needs to be loved, belong to a group, and stuff like that. if you have done that, you can now take care of your ego needs, which is like, the need to have like high self-esteem, to have power, to have prestige, stuff like that. And if you got those, then now you could move on to the final step, which is self-actualization, right? Like the ability to, like express yourself, to like creative things, to uphold your basic values and stuff like that. Now, this is the hierarchy of needs. You could Google it if you want to see how it looks. And again, the idea here is that every step is necessary for the next, right? The idea is that, if you don't have like water right now, you cannot worry about a steady supply of water, right? You need to worry about that. And if you don't have a steady supply of water, you cannot make sure that you have like your social needs met, because those are people who might be competing with you for that sources of water, right? And if you don't have a sense of being loved or belonged or included in the group, then by definition you couldn't have have a feeling of power or recognition within that group, right? So again, the idea is that every step is built on one on top of the other, right? That means that again, the important thing in this hierarchy is on the bottom, right? Not the top, because everything is contingent on the things at the bottom. Please notice that under that framework, one thing could fulfill a few needs, right? So money could probably both take care of your physical needs and ensure security, and to some extent makes it easier to belong to a certain group, for example, right? So this could work. And lastly, please notice that this is framework, right? This is not the ultimate truth, right? Like, I personally don't think that it's the ultimate truth, right? Like, you could see, like, people endangering their lives, i.e., going against their need for security for values they believe in, which is important to self-actualize, right? So obviously it's not true that this is always the case, but I think that in a general sense, the idea that some of our needs can only be met after we have fulfilled other needs is, I think, very much correct, right? I do think that if you're worried just about where your next meal is going to be, this is not the type of situation where you are likely to make friends. So, how could one use that in a debate? So, this is actually a real example from a debate I had in Zagreb. Round 8 was, this house believes that microfinance organizations should offer microfinance loans in developing nations exclusively to women, right? So those are like very small loans, like a few $100s, that in the developing world could be very meaningful to like start a small business and stuff like that. Now, government would probably say this is something that would empower women that are currently oppressed and are disregarded in those developing countries. Opposition might say yes, but women also have a lower chance of succeeding in doing those businesses in the developing world. And what we did in that debate, well, we did a bunch of stuff, but one of the things we did is to weigh those two. Right? So we said, look, there is a need for women to be employed, but they have a lower chance of succeeding, right? And presumably this comes at the expense of other men that would have gotten those microfinances and had a higher chance of succeeding with their business. Okay, and then you would say, okay, which would be more important to a woman to feel empowered by having her business, or to have, like, her husband or someone else close to her succeed himself with his business? And we say, obviously, the second one is more important. Why? Because a successful business in the developing world could mean financial stability, not just for, like, the person in control of the business, but his entire family, perhaps even the entire village where he lives, right? And we're saying financial stability in the developing world, it means, access to clean water. It means access to medicine. And we say no woman would feel empowered if she's just, constantly trying to think where she could get clean water and medicine for her children, right? So the idea is, again, that if you want empowerment, you need to be contingent on the physical security that you could get under our side of the motion. Okay, so this is how you could use that in a debate. Last thing about the last framework about happiness is it's about getting what you want, and here the idea is both the elements of happiness approach and the both the elements of happiness approach and the hierarchy of needs approach, both of them, they want they assume that people want the same things. And this is a problem because people are very different. They live very different lives. You can't just assume all of them want the same things or it would make them happy. Frankly, the only thing that you could know about people is that different things make them happy, and therefore they probably just need to get the things that they want that would make them happy, right? And since that is the case, what you want is actually you want what makes you happy, and getting what you want is what would make you happy. On the contrary, please notice what makes you sad is not getting what you want or getting what you don't want. Well, you don't want cancer, but you got cancer, now you're sad. Now, the question is obviously at this point, this cannot be true all the time, right? Obviously, I would love the ability to fly, right? That would be amazing if I could fly. But it's hard to say that the fact that I can't fly makes me sad, right? Why? Because I don't expect to fly, right? So an important step in this analysis of what you want is what you expect. If you are getting the things that you are expected to get that would make you happy, then you would have. But if you would not get things that you have never expected to get anyway, that would not affect you that much, right? On the contrary, right, if a bad thing happen to you, but this is something that you have expected, and then you wouldn't be it wouldn't hurt you that much, right? When you pay for something, pay for a burger, and then you see that the burger, you have lost money for the burger, you don't just feel sad for losing that money, right? Although you probably want that burger to be even cheaper, right? But you don't feel bad about it because I knew I am going to spend $7 on that burger, right? So it's about managing expectations. And now the question is, what determines our expectations? So I would say three things on that. One, I think our past is a very strong force that determines what do we expect. So I think if you grew up in a household with a lot of money, you would probably expect to make a lot of money growing up. But if you grew up in a poor household, perhaps you would not. If you know that your entire family was sick all the time, then you would expect to get sick. But if everyone was healthy, you would not expect it. So it's about your upbringing. Also about your upbringing is things that you were promised, right? So maybe you lived in a poor household, but your mother always told you before you go to bed, you know what? You're the one to break the cycle. You're the one to make it out there and be rich, right? And then perhaps your expectations are in fact different because of it. A second thing that I think determines our expectations is our peers. So we all compare ourselves to the people we view as our peers. And if my friend from high school got rich, then maybe I expect to get rich as well because he's the same as me in that regard, right? If he could get rich, obviously I could as well, right? So your peers determine your expectations. And last thing I would say about expectations is that they actually update very often, right? So again, it's another known study that you take people who became handicapped, you take people who won the lottery, and obviously the people who became handicapped are very sad, the people who won the lottery are very happy, but that is only true on the short term, because on the long term, you go back a year after, 2 years after, etc., it actually turns out that they are returned to the initial level of happiness that they had before they became handicapped or before they won the lottery. And the reason for that is that we update our expectations very often, right? So if you became handicapped, that sucks because you didn't expect to be handicapped, but after a while you get used to it and you expect to live your lives as a handicap, and therefore it stops troubling you all that much. And if you won the lottery, you know, you didn't expect to win the lottery, it's very happy that it happened to you, but after a while it turns out that you expect a life of wealth, and therefore you don't become happy about it as much. And again, so this is, I think, a good something to note every time you question that. And the question like, where do you get those updates and where not, could be very useful in your analysis. Let's give an example to that. In the motion that we've mentioned before from Mexico, which is, this house prefers a world in which all individuals who have achieved the middle class standard of living choose to pursue the highest level of achievement in their chosen career, rather than a world in which those individuals prioritize day-to-day enjoyment over work. And there, in this debate, you could say from a position, look, very few people obviously can achieve the highest level of achievement, right? Because, you know, it's crowded at the top. But in such a world where everyone drives for that, everyone expects to achieve that, right? This is the narrative that they grow up with. This is the peers that they compare themselves to, and what they expect as well, right? So in such a world, in fact, you don't update your expectations once you fail to get to the top, and you always feel like a failure. Most people feel like a failure. Compare that with, you know, just focusing on the things that make you when you prioritize day-to-day enjoyment, right? Like, you might still have goals and you might not achieve them, but that is okay because your expectation would be updated, right? So you are debating, and even if you don't break very often, you say, well, you know what? It's not like I expect to break every time, but you know, I got like one break. That's cool. So this game of expectation could be very useful in any kind of analysis. Lastly, about getting what you want, I would say, please notice, I think, two key elements that this kind of approach entails. So one means that if it's about people getting what they want, you want to enable people the most freedom that they could get, right? Because the more free they are, the more easier for them is to actually do what they want, right? So I think this is a useful approach every time you want to analyze why we should prioritize freedom in any sense. Secondly, I would say, saying that people just want to be happy is a bit misleading, because we need to take into account identity. Let's give an example. I think closeted gay people, one could say, could do a lot of the things they want if they were straight, right? If they would stay in the closet, they would pretend they're not gay, they could probably do a lot of the other things that they want, which, you know, is not about having sex with guys. But I think but obviously most gay people are not okay with it, right? And it's not because the thing that they do all the day is, you know, being is not because they engage in gay relationships all the time, right? But it's about having an identity, right? You don't want to be happy as a straight person. You want to be, if you're gay, you want to be happy as a gay person, right? And the idea of the closet is exactly the fact that you cannot show your identity and be happy as who you are, right? So the idea is that, yes, we all want to be happy. Everyone can say, I want to be happy, but I want to be happy as myself, and not in general, right? Quickly, how you could use those kinds of analysis in a debate. So in a debate like this house would allow all drugs. From government, they would say, you know what, like, some people really need drugs to be happy. Like, this is the way for them to achieve happiness. And you cannot just know that they would be happy otherwise, right? Like, this is just what they want. And from opposition, I would say, but you know what, the drugs kind of rob you of your identity, right? They turn you into this zombie that only cares about the next hit. And that is robbing you of your identity. And therefore, like, it's not true happiness, in a sense, under drugs, right? Because it's happiness without an identity. And this is probably the reason I think most people, even if offered drugs, like, you know, very strong drugs, usually don't opt for it, right? Like, I think the reason people really afraid of being an addict isn't just like because you're more likely to die as an addict, but I think because you're more likely to live as an addict, which is like, in a sense, not the identity most of us. So this was about happiness. Last thing, let's talk about children. So on children, there are three things that I want to talk about. One is about parenting. The second is about behavior, which mostly is important to youth and not to like, you know, toddlers. And the third one is about other things that affect us that aren't like, you know, parents. Parents and parenting. So let's first of all talk about parenting 101, which is like, what do you need for good parenting, right? So I would say three things on that. One is going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So the same thing that you could say are important for people to be happy as a whole in this hierarchy of needs are very important for a toddler in order to grow up to be a functioning adult, right? So firstly, you need to take care of your physical needs, which is like, you know, making sure that the baby has water and food. Then you need to make sure that they are secured over time to get it they get a steady supply of it. Then you need to make sure that they feel as part of the social group that is the family, and later on other social groups, etc. Right? So you could take the same, I think, kind of analysis and use it here. The second thing you want to know is about development. So the idea is that obviously children don't develop all their skills all at once, right? So like children can maybe able to walk fairly fast, but they can do math a lot later than that, and they could, you know, understand what responsibility is probably even later. And the idea here is that whoever you want to talk about in this debate, whatever the debate is, you probably want to ask yourself what that child has or hasn't developed at that stage, and how that could change different things in the debate. And lastly, it's about what is known as a safe relationship. So the idea here is that a child, to an extent, replicates the relationship that he had or she had with the parents all through his or her life, right? So if, for example, my parents have, you know, taught me that you are loved, you are protected, this is unconditional, we wouldn't leave you just because the things you do, it's very likely that this is the idea of how a relationship should look, that person might later on use with their friends or loved ones or children even themselves, right? But if, for example, that child feels that he is only getting attention if he's doing something remarkable, then, you know, this now child grows up to think that if he wants their spouse to like them, they always need to do remarkable things for them, and that puts a lot of pressure on individual and is kind of bad, right? So this is, and again, one could argue if that is actually true on real studies, but I think it is a fairly useful bit of analysis. Let's see how I could use those bits of analysis that I've just given you. So in the motion, this house would allow prisoners to raise their children behind bars. From government, you probably would say something along the lines of, well, this child is a positive relationship with the parent as the basis for the relationships that they would have in the future. You can't have that in state care. You only could get that from a specific parent who loves you, etc. And feels connected to you. From opposition, I would say, but you know what? You can only develop this kind of safe relationship in a place that takes care of your physical needs, a place that is in fact secure and safe, right? A prison for a child is not secure and safe. It's like, you know, an environment that is marred by violence all the time, and therefore you cannot expect a child to live there. So this is, I think, about, you know, what makes for good parenting. But let's talk about now parenting 102, which is what is actually the point of parenting, right? Like, what are we parenting the child for? And the idea here, And I think it's also very useful in debates about education, right? That you want to say that the school probably, to an extent, is kind of like a parent in the sense that you want to make the child into like, you know, an adult, and the question is, how do you turn them into functioning adults in that sense? So the point is, in that sense, is one way to view parenting is, you know, it's just like, you know, it's about preparing you for adulthood. There's some things that adults need to have, and you're giving them that, right? So you're giving them, like, you know, social skills, and you give them certain knowledge about the world, and you give them certain values that you need to be part of our society and stuff like that, right? So it's about preparing them for adulthood. A second view would be that, you know, it's actually not preparing you for like being an adult, right? Because, you know, that is a very unspecific thing. It's actually just about giving you the options, right? It's about making sure that you take chances on different stuff, and, you know, you probably want to learn different subjects, and you want to go to have different friends, just to, you know, you find out what the different options out there, and through that you could, as an adult, whatever you would choose to be, you would have like the previous experience to know whether it's a route you want to go down, right? The last thing is about just creating independence, right? So you can say, you know what, it's actually not about being an adult in a way. The most important thing is to create independence, right? In a sense, the most important thing for a child is to make sure that they stop being a child, they stop being under the influence of the parent, and are actually just like, you know, under a person of their own. And then the most important thing there is, like, you know, to actually, it's still probably to to let them experience and do stuff, but now the focus is not about, like, you know, have they seen something new, is like, did they do it alone, right? Did they make something for themselves? Have they disconnected from the parent, school, whatever, right? So again, how we would use all of those in a debate. So in a debate like this, how should they additional benefits to families and welfare according to their child's performance in school, right? Like if the child does better, then they get more money. So from government, you say, look, this is a good policy, right? Because it pushes children to do better at school, which means, how do you do better at school? You take those tools, like the knowledge and the values that you get in school, and if you apply it well, you get higher grades, and therefore that means that those children are in fact better prepared for adulthood, right? On the other hand, from opposition, I would say, wait, but that pushes children to, right, only do what they're good at, right? To only study subjects that they could get high grades in, and therefore they do not explore other new options, right? That is a great problem, because then they might do things that they would not be happy with as adults. More than that, if that child is constantly being pushed by this agenda, or, like, you know, their parents that constantly pushing them to do well at school, that comes at the expense of that child actually creating independence and creating his own way of doing things, and that makes him like, you know, not a fully functioning adult in that sense. So that was parenting 102. It was about, as I said, what is the parenting for? Let's talk about the behavior of youth, right? So you could analyze the behavior of youth the same way you analyze any other behavior, like, you know, using beliefs and desires. But I think there are three things you probably want to focus on. One is the fact that teenagers are incredibly ego-focused, right? It means that they care about themselves. They see the world through their own point of view. They find it harder to consider other point of views. They find it harder to consider more complex or nuanced point of views, unless it's the one that, as I said, they are currently holding, seeing things through other people's lens, etc. The second thing is that they are obviously incredibly affected by their peers and society, I would say to a much larger degree than most people in society, right? Like it's sad, but like we seriously see teens killing themselves because of the bullying that they suffer from their peers. You hardly ever see that with adults. And lastly, it's about the identity formation, right? So because they're in a step in their lives where they are trying to figure out who they are, what they like, what they believe. These are all obviously things that are very unique to being a teenager. That is what you could say drive them to do, like, you know, stupid or crazy things because they want to check the boundaries and what they do like and what they don't to evolve, etc. How could they use this kind of analysis in a debate? So it's in a debate like this house would aggressively stream children from a young age according to their abilities. So, you know, you take the children who are very good at sports and you put them with all the other kids who are good at sports. Take the ones who are good at math, put them with the other kids who are good at math, etc. And you could say, as an opposition, look, like, you take a teenager in their form, like before even, but during their formative years, they are in a society, in a class only with their own peers. They are told that they are better. All their peers think of themselves that they are better. That feeds into their feeling of superiority. They fail to see other accounts of what could be happening, could be at play here, because they are incredibly ego focused, and that makes them to act in a way that is incredibly focused only on succeeding in school, and they don't care about other subjects. They do not care about being good people. They do not care about their friends. Like, I mean, care about their friends in the sense of like, you know, helping them in that way, and then, like, you know, they grow out to be like insufferable adults, and they are insufferable in the process, right? So this is how you could say that they would behave badly, I would say, because of all those things I've just specified. The last thing about children is talking about all the rest of the things that affect children, because usually we say that only it is like only parents are necessarily the most influential figure. However, again, one could say it's for the better or for worse. Parents probably are not the most influential figures in a child's life. There are 4 others contenders in that sense. So one is role models, and obviously your parents are role models to an extent. But the thing is, parents are very flawed role models, right? Sometimes they are mad at you. Sometimes you see them screwing up. Thing like, you know, Superman, he's in a sense, he's perfect, right? He's very good looking, and he's like incredibly moral, and he has super strength, right? Like, in a sense, those kind of role models are like the extremity of the fact that they are so extremely role model makes them incredibly powerful in that sense. The second thing is about friends. So if you think about it, we expect children to, like, you know, look up to adults and learn from them, but it's very hard to do because an adult is a very different person from you as a child, right? Like, the adult doesn't go with you to school. The adult goes to work, which you don't do. The adult eats or drinks stuff that you don't. The adult does things in the house that you are not allowed to touch. So it's actually not a very good influence on your behavior in the sense of copying what they do, because they are frankly not like you in a lot of senses. Your friends are a lot like you, and this is why you act a lot more like your friends and learn from them as a child than from any other thing. The third is obviously school. So this is where children spend most of their days under strict authority figures who are the teachers, and they are being told all the time like what they should do in school and what they shouldn't. It's obviously a very, very influential part of a child's life. And obviously there's culture, right? So there are cultures all around us. There's TV, there's commercials, there are the things you eat, the things you wear, the things you play. Those are the things that are literally constantly all around you, right? Which is, I think, part of the reason why we see, for example, that even progressive parents who do not want to impose a gender role on their children many times end up doing that still, right? Because it's not about what you do, it's about the culture and the patriarchal culture that your child is growing up in that is very much influential. So again, how I would use that in a debate, for example, in a motion like this, how supports homeschooling? From opening opposition, you might say that the state needs to make sure that the parents don't teach terrible stuff, right? And government might say, oh wait, the parents are the most influential figures, so it doesn't matter if you send into school against the parents' will. It's not like they're going to listen to whatever is going on there. So if you come from closing opposition, you say, well, you know what, school still affects them to a very large extent, right? It's where all their friends are, and there are lots of the time, and there are strict authority figures, blah, blah, interesting we just said. So they are going to be incredibly influenced in that sense. So that is it for me. This was quite long anyway. Let's make a quick recap. Psychological arguments are sadly usually underdeveloped in most debates. That is because people don't bother to break them down into the beliefs and desires that are in the back of those of the actions when they're analyzing actions. If they want to talk about what makes people happy, they don't break down the components of happiness. And if they want to talk about children, they don't talk about the specific things that are different for children. So when you want to talk about actions, always identify the desires and the beliefs that are in the core of it. Talk about biases that could influence. Talk about habits and role models and peer pressure and authorities that could be influencing it. When talking about happiness, have a framework of happiness. It could be the idea that there are component, specific things that make you happy. It could be the hierarchy of needs. It could be about the things you want and the expectations. And if you're talking about children, make sure you explain what children need to grow up, what is the point of parenting. If you're talking about youth, what drives them and their actions, and consider the other influential figures who aren't just parents, like role models, friends, school, and culture. Before I leave you off, I would say two things. A, I don't know like how much of that was actually recorded and how much was just like a blank screen. If it would turn out that sadly most of it is a blank screen, perhaps we would upload this again. I would talk to Olivia, see if that could work. Secondly, I want to see if there are any questions going on. So I'm going to log on here on YouTube and see if someone has said anything, except then complaints that you don't see the feed, which would be probably understandable at this point. So let's see if there's something. Yeah, the fact that my phone is very slow is probably isn't helping at this point. Just a second. Also, yeah, I was told I need to keep it for under 2 hours, so YouTube wouldn't cut me. So let's see if we can maintain that. Yeah, I think we're running very, very close to 2 hours. Anyway, and I don't see here any questions. Okay, so if you have, and I don't see a feed either. If you have any questions, you could always probably find me on Facebook. It's Roy Schulman. The way it's written in this the way it's written here in this video. It was lovely to be here. Come to Novi Sad, which I'm sure would be great. I would be there. I would probably be making some psychological arguments in at least some debates, and I hope you would do the same.